It was a nice summer day. My 5-year-old son, James, was playing outside in the backyard of our suburban home. James has always been a quiet boy. He plays by himself mostly. He has never had many friends, but he has always had a wild imagination. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog Fido when I heard what sounded like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who he was talking to. Could he have finally made a friend? Being a single mom, it's hard for me to always keep an eye on my son, so I decided to go out and check on him. When I went into the backyard, I was a bit confused because James was the only person back there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I heard another voice. "James, it's time to come inside," I called out to him. He came inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was about lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. "James, who are you talking to out there?" I asked. James looked up for a moment. "I was playing with my new friend," he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to pry as any good mother would. "Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you ask him to have lunch with us?" I asked. James stared at me for a moment before replying. "His name is Laughing Jack." I was a bit taken aback by what he said. "Oh, that's a strange name. What does your friend look like?" I asked, a bit confused. "He's a clown. He has long hair and a big swirly cone nose. He's got long arms and baggy pants with stripy socks, and he always smiles." I realized my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I suppose it is normal for kids his age to have imaginary friends, especially when he has no real kids to play with. It's probably just a phase. The rest of the day went by as per usual, and it started to get late, so I put James to bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and made sure to turn his nightlight on before I closed the door. I was pretty tired myself, so I decided to go to bed not long after. I had an awful nightmare. It was dark. I was in some kind of rundown amusement park. I was scared, running through an endless field of empty tents, broken down rides, and abandoned game huts. The whole place had a horrible look to it. Everything was black and white, and prize stuffed animals all hung from nooses in the game huts, all with sick grins stitched to their faces. I felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there wasn't another living thing in sight. Then suddenly, I began to hear music play. The sounds of Pop Goes the Weasel being played on a squeeze box echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I followed its tune into the circus tent, almost in a trance, unable to stop my legs from moving forward. It was pitch black. The only light came from a single spotlight shining in the center of the big top. As I walked towards the light, the music slowed down. I found myself singing along, unable to stop. "All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel, the monkey dwells all in fun." The music stopped right before its climax, and suddenly the light shot on. The intensity of the lights was practically blinding. All I could see was a small dark silhouette shuffling towards me. Then another one appeared, and another, and another. There was dozens of them, all coming towards me. I couldn't move, my legs were frozen. All I could do was watch as these haunting figures drew near. As they got closer, I could see they were children. As I looked at each one, I noticed they were all horrifyingly disfigured and mutilated. Some had cuts all over their body, others were severely burned, and others were missing limbs, even eyes. The children enveloped me, clawing at my flesh, dragging me onto the ground, and tearing inside me. As the children tore me apart and I faded away, all I could hear was laughter, horrible, awful, evil laughter. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. After taking a few deep breaths, I looked over and saw that a few of James' action figures were positioned facing me on top of my nightstand. I sighed. James had probably woken up early and put these here. I gathered up the toys and made my way to James's room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged and placed the toys back into his toy box. I headed out to the living room. A little while later, James woke up and I made him breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a bit groggy. Perhaps he didn't sleep well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. "James, honey, did you put the toys in Mommy's room this morning?" His eyes shot up at me for a moment, then quickly glanced back down at his cereal. "Laughing Jack did it." I rolled my eyes at the response. "Will you tell Laughing Jack to keep the toys in your room?" James nodded and finished up his breakfast, then decided to go play in the backyard. I went to relax in the living room, and I must have dozed off because I woke up a couple hours later. Shit, I need to go check on James. I was a bit worried. It had been over 2 hours and I haven't checked on him. I stepped out into the backyard, but James wasn't there anymore. I was getting a bit nervous, so I called out to him, "James, James, where are you?" Just then I heard a giggle come from the front yard. I rushed through the gate around to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. "James, how many times have I told you to stay in the backyard?" "James, what are you eating?" James looked up at me and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of hard candies in all colors. This made me very nervous. "James, who gave you that candy?" James just stared at me, not speaking. "James, please tell Mommy where you got that candy." James hung his head down and said, "Laughing Jack gave it to me." My heart sank. I kneeled down and looked him in the eye. "James, I've had enough of this damn Laughing Jack thing. He is not real. Now this is a very serious situation and I need to know who gave you the candy." I could see my son's eyes tear up. "But Mama, Laughing Jack did give me the candy." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James has never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I made him spit out the candy and I threw the rest away. James appears to be fine. Maybe I'm just overreacting. After all, he could have gotten it from Tom and Linda from next door or Mr. Walker from down the street. Either way, I'm going to have to keep a closer eye on James. That night, I put James to bed as usual and decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly, I woke up by a loud bang coming from the kitchen. I sprung out of bed and hurried down the stairs. When I got to the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the counters had been thrown to the floor, and our dog Fido hung dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and stuffed with candy, the same type that James was eating earlier that day. My shock was quickly broken by a sharp scream coming from James's room, followed by loud crashes. I quickly grabbed a knife from the drawer and moved up the stairs with a speed that only a mother whose child is in danger could have. I bursted through the door and flicked on the lights. Everything in the room was knocked over and tossed on the floor. My poor son in his bed crying and shaking with fear. A pool of urine stained the sheets. I scooped my child up and ran out of the house and went next door to Tom and Linda's house. Luckily they were still awake. They let me use their phone and I called the police. It didn't take them long to arrive and I realized what had happened. They looked at me as if I were crazy. They searched the house, but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trashed rooms. The officers told me that someone had probably gotten into the house and done this right before making a quick escape when they heard me coming up the stairs. I knew it wasn't true. All the doors were locked and none of the windows were open. Whatever was in my house didn't come from outside. The next day, James stayed inside. I didn't want him to leave my sight. I went into the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything comes into it tonight, I was going to be able to hear it. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the drawer, and I put it on my nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not letting anybody hurt my little boy. Soon enough, night came. I put James to bed. He was afraid. I promised him that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and turned on the nightlight. Before closing the door, I whispered to him, "Good night, James. I love you." I tried to stay up as long as I could, but after a few hours, I felt myself drifting off. My baby would be safe for the night, and I needed to sleep. Just as I laid my head on the pillow, I heard a soft noise come from the baby monitor I had put on my nightstand. At first, it sounded like interference, like the kind of radio would make. Then it turned into a soft moan. Was James asleep? Then I heard it, the laugh from my nightmare, that horrible laugh. I sprung up from bed and grabbed the knife from under my pillow. I rushed over to James's room and creaked the door open. I tried the light switch, but it wouldn't come on. I took a step in and I could feel the warm, thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly, James's nightlight came on and I could see the absolute horror laid out in front of me. James's body was nailed up on the wall. The nails pierced through his hands and feet. His chest was cut wide open and his organs hung down to the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe this was my baby boy. Then I heard it again, the soft, desperate moan. James was still alive, my baby, my poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and vomited on the floor, but my sickness was interrupted by a horrible cackle coming from behind me. I spun around while still wiping bile from my mouth. Then out of the shadows emerged the fiend responsible for all this horror, Laughing Jack. His ghost white skin and matted black hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes surrounded by dark black rings. His twisted smile revealed a row of sharp, jagged teeth, and his skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He wore a patchy black and white clown outfit with striped sleeves and socks. His body itself was grotesque, his long arms hanging down past his waist, and the way he was posed made him look like almost boneless, like a rag doll. He let out a sickening laugh as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. Then he turned around slowly in front of James and began to laugh even more at the horrific sight he has laid out. That was enough to shake me from my terror. I snapped, "Get away from him, you bastard!" I rushed at the monster, raising the knife above my head and stabbed down at him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared into a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed through and pierced James' still beating heart, splashing the warm blood on my face. "No, what have I done? My baby! I killed my baby!" I immediately fell to my knees, and I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. "My boy, my sweet baby boy. I promised Mommy would protect you, but I failed. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry." The police arrived soon to find me in front of my son, still wielding the knife covered in my baby's blood. The trial was short. Insanity. I was placed in the Foropolis house of the criminally insane, where I've been for the past 2 months. It's not so bad here. The only reason I'm awake now is because someone is playing Pop Goes the Weasel outside my window. I'll talk to the orderlies about it in the morning. In 1938, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connected to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. Without no possible way to communicate with others or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. Repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversating with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming, and every waking moment his conscience was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against a wall, trying to allocate a pain response. He begged the scientists a sedative so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-fictional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were defending and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Hello, my name is Mitch. I'm here to tell you guys about an experience I had. I don't know if it was paranormal or whatever, stupid words people use to describe supernatural phenomenon. But after that thing visited me, I believe in the paranormal trash now. A week after I moved in with my brother Edwin, after my house was foreclosed, I finished unpacking. Edwin liked my idea of me moving in, since we had not seen each other for 10 years, so I was excited. I soon fell asleep after I moved in. After that first week, I heard rustling noises coming from outside about 1 in the morning. I thought it was a raccoon, so I ignored it and tried to fall asleep. The next morning, I told Edwin about it, and he agreed. The next night, however, I thought I heard my window opening and a loud thump, as if something entered my room. I darted up and looked around my room, but I saw nothing. The next morning, Edwin dropped his coffee cup when he saw me. He held me by a nearby mirror and I saw myself. I had a large gash in my left cheek. After I was rushed to the hospital, my doctor told me that I must have been sleepwalking. He showed me something that made my blood turn cold. He lifted up my shirt to reveal a sewn-up incision where my kidneys were. I stared into his eyes. Mine were widening. "You somehow lost your left kidney last night," my doctor told me. "We don't know how though. Sorry, Mitch." The next night was my breaking point. At around midnight, I woke up to see a truly terrifying sight. I was staring face to face with a creature with a black hoodie and a dark blue mask with no nose or mouth staring down at me. The thing that scared me the most was that it had no eyes, just empty, black sockets. The creature also had some black substance dripping from its sockets. I grabbed a camera from the nearby mantle and took a picture. Immediately after taking the shot, the creature lunged at me and tried to claw open my chest to get into my lungs. I stopped it by kicking it in the face. As I ran out of my room, I grabbed my wallet. I would need the money. I ran out of my brother's house that night, and I ended up in the woods near Edwin's house and tripped on a rock. I fell unconscious and woke up in the hospital. My doctor, the same one who treated me before, entered the room. "I have good news and bad news, Mitch," my doctor started. "The good news is that you had minor injuries and your parents are going to pick you up." I sighed with relief. "The bad news is that your brother has been killed by something." My parents took me back to Edwin's house to collect my remaining belongings, which I did. Upon entering my room, I was scared, but remained calm. I grabbed my camera and then stopped dead in my tracks. In the hallway leading to my room, I saw Edwin's body and something lying next to it. I retrieved it and entered into my parents' car, not mentioning Edwin's corpse. I looked at the thing I had picked up and nearly vomited. I was holding my stolen half-eaten kidney with some black substance on it.